Do we have free will, or are we prisoners of fate? Do the Stoics believe that we have free will, or that our lives are predetermined? Does it matter if we have free will or not? Well, in today's episode, I want to talk about some of the Stoic ideas as well as modern neuroscience behind free will and fate, and see how we might be able to just take a little bit more control of our lives and wrestle it back from fate. Hello, friends. My name is Eric Cloward, and welcome to the Stoic Coffee Break. The Stoic Coffee Break is a weekly podcast where I take aspects of Stoicism and do my best to break them down to their most important points. I share my thoughts on Stoic philosophy as well as bringing in modern wisdom and anything that I can bring to the table to help you to think a little bit better. And I try to do this all within the space of a coffee break. This week's episode is called, Is Free Will a Lie That We Tell Ourselves? Lead me, fate, wherever you will, and I will cheerfully follow. For even if I kick and wail, all the same, I must follow. Cleanthes. So a few weeks ago, I got a request on YouTube to create an episode discussing free will. So from even the earliest days of philosophy, this remains one of the oldest and thorniest questions. Do we have free will, or is life simply deterministic and we are ruled by fate? So as philosophers, the Stoics certainly had some ideas on whether we are slaves of fate, doomed by deterministic forces, or if we actually have free will. And while it may feel like fate and free will are binary options, either we have free will or we don't, the Stoics had a more nuanced approach. Now, some people might wonder why this even matters. If we have free will, then the choices we make are our own. If we don't have free will, then we at least have the illusion of free will, and isn't that good enough? But I think that understanding this does actually influence how we make choices and how we can change the behaviors in our lives. So at first glance, Stoicism might seem deterministic. After all, the Stoics believed in fate and the idea that the universe unfolds according to a rational and necessary order governed by the logos, which they define as universal reason or divine intelligence. But they also held that human beings possess free will, or more accurately, the capacity for prohairesis, which means rational choice or moral volition. So let's unpack both these ideas and how the Stoics reconcile them. So first, fate, the cosmic order. So the Stoics believe that everything in the universe happens according to the logos, which is the rational principle that structures all things. This is why we have something rather than nothing, and how the universe, keeps moving the way that it does. Basically, it's kind of like a physics in more modern parlance. So for them, though, fate is the total chain of causes, the idea that everything has a cause, and those causes are interlinked into a seamless web of necessity, that nothing happens by chance, and that everything unfolds as it must based on prior causes. So Chrysippus, a key Stoic thinker, said that everything that happens is followed by something else, which depends on it by causal necessity. Likewise, everything that happens is preceded by something with which it is causally connected. So, yes, the Stoics are determinist in the cosmic sense. Now let's talk about free will, or prohairesis, which again is defined as moral choice. So within this deterministic universe, the Stoics argued that our judgments, choices, and responses are up to us. This is prohairesis, again, moral choice, and it's our rationality which allows us to give or withhold assent to impressions, choose how we interpret and respond to events, and to live in accordance with nature, meaning we live rationally and virtuously. So Epictetus says, some things are up to us and some things are not. And really what it comes down to, according to the Stoics, is the only thing that is truly up to us is how we use our rational faculty, meaning our judgments and the choices that we make and the actions that we take. So how do they reconcile these two things? Well, this is where it gets a little bit deep. So the Stoics saw no contradiction between fate and free will. Instead, they believed in the compatibility of these two forces. So fate determines the circumstances, and free will determines our responses within those circumstances. So as an analogy, it's kind of like when you're playing a video game. The game's programming, fate, sets the rules, the obstacles, and the events. But you can still control the joystick. You choose your actions within the system. You're not free from the game structure, but you're free within it. And Marcus Aurelius captures this duality when he said, just that you do the right thing, the rest doesn't matter, and the choice is yours. So let's talk about the Stoic view on responsibility. So this framework makes Stoicism empowering because you're not a passive victim of fate. You have agency in how you respond, and your moral character is yours to shape. So Seneca reminds us the wise man is not disturbed by things that go against his plan, for he has planned not to succeed, but to do what is right. That's why a Stoic can be calm and active, even in terrible circumstances. They trust fate, but they also take full responsibility for their moral choices. So let's move a little bit closer to modern day. So back in the 1980s, there was a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet, and he did a series of experiments where subjects were told to move their wrist whenever they wanted. And they watched a clock-like device and reported the moment that they first became aware of the intention to move their wrist. Meanwhile, electrodes, and later fMRI and EEG in updated versions, measured brain activity. And the key finding was that brain activity, meaning readiness potential, began about 350 to 400 milliseconds before the person reported conscious intention. The conscious decision came later, about 150 to 200 milliseconds before the actual movement. In other words, it seems like your brain decides before you are consciously aware of deciding. Now, this suggested that your conscious experience was more one of making a decision and then being informed of the decision that your brain had already made. So there were later experiments with fMRI. So in the 2000s and the 2010s, there were advanced experiments using fMRI machines that expanded on Libet's work. So studies like those by John Dylan Haynes and others showed that researchers could actually predict a person's choice up to 7 to 10 seconds before they were aware of deciding. Now, these predictions weren't perfect. They were around 60 to 70%, but they were significantly better than chance. So as an example of these experiments, in one experiment, subjects were told to either press a right or a left button whenever they wished. And the fMRI could detect a pattern of brain activity that predicted which of the buttons they'd press before they consciously made the choice. And what were the conclusions? Well, this opened up a huge debate. So there was one interpretation that free will is just an illusion, and that consciousness is like a narrator telling a story about decisions we've already made subconsciously, and that we don't initiate any actions, we only become aware of them after they are underway. And this view is associated with thinkers like Sam Harris and many hard determinists. So the alternative interpretation and the growing consensus is that these early brain signals may represent preparatory processes, not final decisions, meaning that conscious veto still seems possible, meaning even if brain activity gears up for a choice, conscious awareness might still stop or redirect the action at the last moment. Libet himself noticed that people could consciously veto the action even after the readiness potential began. He thought this showed that while we might not start the process, we can still intervene. Libet wrote, "The initiation of a freely voluntary act appears to begin in the unconscious, but the conscious function still has the power to veto." And this is sometimes called free won't, the idea that you can override impulses even if you can't stop them from arising. Conscious choice might happen after the unconscious brain preparation, but conscious veto, stopping or changing course, still seems possible. So how does this relate to Stoicism? So this idea is actually very Stoic. As Epictetus explains, impressions striking a person's mind as soon as he perceives something within range of his senses are not voluntary or subject to his will. They impose themselves on people's attention almost with a will of their own. But the act of assent, which endorses these impressions, is voluntary and a function of the human will. Basically, you don't control the impressions that hit you, meaning your first reaction, but you do control whether you give assent to those impressions, meaning you have agency over your judgment and your response to those impressions. In other words, choice isn't about controlling your instincts. It's about consciously accepting, rejecting, or shaping actions once the impulse actually arises. Almost like your consciousness is the quality control department, not the factory itself, and that free will might be less about pure origination of will and more about selective approval or rejection of impulses. So there are some critiques about Libet's experiments. And while Libet's findings shook up neuroscience, many researchers today argue that his conclusions were overstated. And here are some of the critiques. Readiness potential might not mean decision made. The brain activity Lebet measured, meaning the readiness potential, might just reflect the general preparation to act, not the decision itself. In other words, the brain might just be gearing up, getting systems online, before a specific decision is actually finalized. Kind of like loading up a video game before you've even selected start. Another critique was that real-world decisions are much more complex. Lebet's experiments tested very simple reactions, meaning just flexing your wrist. But real decisions, like choosing a career, ending a relationship, or starting a company, involve complex reasoning, values, emotional weighting, and social context. It's unlikely that these multi-layered decisions work exactly the same way as a reflexive wrist movement. Free will might be less about random in-the-moment button pressing and more about long-term patterns of reflection, commitment, and value-driven action. That it's a skill of consistent adjustment and self-mastery in the face of external events outside of our control. So how does this play into responsibility and ethics? Meaning, who's to blame? So here's a tough question. If our actions are caused by prior conditions, are we morally responsible? Well, the Stoics say yes, because your nature is rational and social. You are responsible not because you are outside of cause and effect, but because you are aware of it, because you can reflect, because you can choose better next time. And that's enough to build a moral framework. And that's enough to hold people accountable, not just out of blame, but out of respect for their capacity to grow. So Marcus Aurelius said, "No soul is willingly deprived of the truth." When people do wrong, the Stoics don't react with outrage, they respond with understanding. But they still uphold justice, and they still draw boundaries. They still act, just not with hatred or resentment. So how do we apply some of these ideas in our actual lives? So Epictetus said, "Don't let the force of the impression when it first hits you knock you off of your feet. Just say to it, hold on a moment. Let me see who you are and what you represent." So if you think of free will as freedom to veto and shape, then it becomes a skill, something that you can actually cultivate. And neuroscience shows that automatic behaviors dominate when we're not paying attention, but that you can reprogram your defaults through practice. The more you practice stopping, reflecting, and choosing a better action, the more your default wiring improves over time. So here's how you can train your Stoic free will and build what neuroscience calls better executive control. So here's a simple daily routine. So first you have your morning setup, and this can last about 2 to 5 minutes. You reflect on likely challenges that you're going to face today, and you visualize your best response. And this is the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, where we imagine the challenging scenarios beforehand. Because the more you can make decisions before they actually happen, the more likely you are to make better choices in the moment. Next is the in-the-moment practice. So the Stoics taught that impressions happen automatically. You can't stop the first thought. But there's a gap before you give assent to it, meaning you believe it or you act on it. And training awareness of this gap is the most powerful self-improvement tool that you actually have. Whenever an impulse arises, just pause, count to 3, and ask, is this reaction useful? Is it virtuous? Is it true? Now, as a backup practice, you can practice your veto power. If you find it hard to make the right choice, practice your veto power on bad choices. For example, choose not to send that angry email. Choose not to binge another show when you're tired. Choose not to quit when you're facing difficulty. Because sometimes it's easier to say no to something than it is to make a conscious effort to actually do something. Next, you have your evening reflection. And this is where you journal briefly in the evening and you ask yourself the following questions. When did you act on impulse? When did you pause and choose? And what do you want to do to be better tomorrow? Taking the time each evening to reflect on your choices throughout the day is helpful not only for tracking your progress, but to reinforce the wins that you have and to find areas for improvement. Now, as a bonus practice, once or twice a day, try delaying gratification. This strengthens your prefrontal cortex, your executive veto system, and these little moments build the muscle of Stoic free will. They sharpen your awareness, and they turn your unconscious habits into conscious action. So, where does this leave us? The debate over free will versus fate is one that will probably continue to be debated long into the future. And while there are no clear answers, I've found that the Stoic view seems to work best for me. While you may live in a world that is shaped by fate, your freedom lies not in escaping the chain of cause and effect, but in owning your link in it. Freedom means shaping, vetoing, and steering the impulses that arise naturally. And you are free by exercising rational control within your constraints. You're not the architect of the universe, but you are the architect of your response. And really, that's enough. And that's really everything. And that's the end of this week's Stoic Coffee Break. If this episode helped you to shift your thinking, please share it with a friend, since word of mouth is the best way to help this podcast grow. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the show so you don't miss an episode. I wanted to let you know that my book, Stoicism 101, is out and available. You can find out more information on my website at stoic.coffee. And as always, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and thanks for listening.